And do you see yourself? I'll just close this. Okay. So first thing to introduce myself. So my name is Noémie. I'm originally from Canada, where I studied cognitive neuroscience. But actually, as I was doing research, I realized that there were some issues in the research system that bothered me quite a bit. So I decided to change my field of interest from cognitive neuroscience to research integrity. And that led me to Europe and then to Belgium, where I did a PhD on research integrity. And I just defended my thesis in October. So I'll show you the work of my PhD, but I'll also show you some questions, some topics that I want your help on. So the title of my thesis was The Failure of Success, Careers, Cultures, and Integrity in Science. And the baseline for my PhD project was really integrity in science. So my PhD project was focusing on integrity. But in my first doctoral committee meeting, we had an interesting discussion with my committee members. And one of the first questions that came up was, where will you publish your first papers? And then I said, I really wanted to publish it in PLOS ONE because I like their editorial vision. I like that it's open access. And that started a whole debate between the committee members. One saying, no, you have to publish in a high impact journal. This is one of your first publications, so you should select based on impact factor. And another one saying, no, you should publish open access. This is important work. So that led me to be very interested in the meaning of success in science. And based on that, I decided to introduce success in science as an important part of my PhD and to look at how success in science influences research integrity. So this is the baseline for my PhD project. My project started in 2015 and ended in 2020. And my supervisor was Wim Pinkston at Hasselt University in Belgium. So in this presentation, I'll just show you the 4 different steps of my project, and I'll explain a bit about the findings of these steps. They're all published. I'll put the slides in the chat box later on, so you can have a look if you want more details. So the first step of my project was to conduct a literature review, like most research projects, right? And I decided to look at research on research integrity. So I did sort of a meta research review. And I extracted articles that did research on research integrity. So I won't go in detail, but I just want to say I included 955 articles that I classified by topics. But what is really interesting is 331 of these articles that were empirical. And from that, I extracted a bit about their methodology, their approach, the population they were studying, and etc. And there's 2 findings in particular that were really important for my findings. So the first one is that I realized that we know a lot about researchers, but very little about other research actors. So in the articles that I extracted, most of them studied researchers and research students, but very few studied other actors in the population. And I found that this was a problem because these other actors are also part of the system, and they also have an important role in setting the scene for research integrity. The second finding that I had from my literature review was that we know the academic system is part of the problem, but we don't address it. So what I did is I had some papers that described the causes for misconduct or questionable research practices, and I had some papers that described approaches. How can we make it better? And I extracted which causes and approaches they were talking about. So what I found is that most papers said that the problem of research integrity and questionable research practices was in the academic system, but most of them looking at approaches were actually looking for awareness and compliance. So we have an imbalance here. So based on these 2 findings, I continued my research project, and I conducted interviews in focus groups. So like most previous research, I included the researchers and the research students, but as I said, we don't know so much about other research actors, so I decided to involve them in my interviews in my focus group. So I had a whole array of different research actors, and in total, I had 56 participants, sometimes in focus groups, sometimes in interviews, and I asked them 3 main questions. So the first question that I asked everyone was, what leads researchers to success? The second question was, what threatens research integrity? And the third question was, who is responsible for the problems and for solving the problems that are currently existing in the system? So first question, what leads to success? What I found was that success was a mix of different factors, some of them related to the researcher, some of them related to the output, some of them related to the process, how the research is conducted. And into that came luck, that also played a role into all of these factors. But when I asked about current research assessments, I realized that the outputs are overrepresented. They really take the lead, while the processes is almost not looked at. So we know what research produces, but we don't know how it's conducted. Then I asked my second question of what threatens research integrity. And the message was pretty clear that actually current research assessments are a big threat for research integrity. And that's not only because they overvalue output, they ignore important process, like I just said, but also because they accept exceptional output. So they discourage realism from researchers. They also look at researchers individually, so they discourage collaboration. And they are based on competition, so they discourage openness and collegiality. So this was my first finding from the interviews in the focus group. But then I also found that there was an extreme funnel structure in research careers. So I studied in Flanders, and in Flanders it's pretty clear that for every 10 PhD students that enter in academia, there's only 1 that will make it to become a professor. So there's a really steep funnel structure with a few more getting a postdoc and then only 1 getting a professorship, a tenured permanent position in academia. So this funnel has a lot of problems, and I want to present 4 that were mentioned in my interviews in my focus group. So the first one is that it creates a highly competitive environment. And this competition leads to a lot of stress, isolation, mental health risk. We know more and more that there are a lot of mental health risks in PhD student populations. And it also leads to insecurity because you don't know if you're going to keep your job. And when you're at the postdoc level, you're normally starting to build a family, buying a house, things that require you to have some sort of financial security. So that's the first problem. Second problem, it's also that it blocks diversity. So my respondents were pretty clear by saying that there's a lot of diversity in PhD students entering in academia, but there's only one type of profile that makes it to the end. And this type of profile is the typical PI. Of course, this is a bit of a caricature, but I saw it as if universities were trying to make a football team, and they don't select any goalkeepers, they don't select any defenders, they select only the strikers. And that was mentioned to be a very big problem in academia. The third problem comes from those who leave academia. And of course, out of 10 students, if 9 leave, that means that's a lot of people. And some of them will gladly leave academia, but the majority of them are taught, or there have been studies showing that the majority of PhD students would like to stay into academia. So that means that there's a lot of them that are leaving with a feeling of failure. In my interviews, I involved some researchers who had left academia, and I could really find from the way they were describing their departure from academia that they felt like they were a failure. They were not good enough, they were not a real scientist, and that's why they left academia. So I think this is something that's really important to consider about this funnel structure. And finally, this funnel structure also solidifies the problems that exist in the research culture. So what I mean by that is that this professor that made it to get a tenured position is also the one who will teach the young students on how to survive in the system. So that professor will teach about how to produce output that the system wants, how to produce impressive metrics, how to gain a competitive advantage over your peers, and the PhD students will learn these skills from their professors. And that's completely natural because this is how this professor managed to survive in the system. So I just want to read you two quotes from PhD students on that point, which I think were really crucial in my PhD. So, and in finding this whole impact of the professor on the PhD student. So when I had a focus group with PhD students, they were really fond of open access. They were really fond of sharing their data, collaborating. That was something that was really important for them. But many said that their supervisor wouldn't let them collaborate and be so open. So I'll just read you two quotes. So one said, "My promoter, which is the supervisor in Belgium, is always so reluctant to let me go and show the data to other people. He's always so scared that other people are going to steal his data, his ideas, sorry." And another one said, "I can't present on a congress because there are only 3 articles published on the subjects that I'm studying. So the supervisors are scared that if I make a poster I present, that other researchers will get interested in the same topic. And if they publish first, all I'm doing is a waste of time." So there's really that sense of the supervisor helping them gain a competitive advantage by keeping their data and their work secret so that they don't get scooped. And finally, the last question of my interviews and focus group was who's responsible for the problems and who's responsible for solving the problems. So being a researcher myself, I would have expected that the institution leaders, so like the university leaders, the policymakers, the research funders, and the editors and publishers have a key role to play to change the problem of success in science, integrity in science. And I did find that, but because I interviewed all of these different actors, I actually found a pretty complex football game of everyone passing the ball to everyone and everyone saying that everyone else is responsible and it's not their fault and it's not their responsibility to solve it. But most importantly, I found that nobody felt able to change the system. They felt like the system was how it is. They felt that alone they couldn't do anything. So we felt a clear sense of helplessness that we cannot make any change to make the scientific system better. So now the third step of my PhD was to conduct a survey. So I conducted a survey with researchers. It was a small survey. In Flanders, I had 126 respondents, and I wanted to understand how researchers distribute their time. And I also wanted to understand what they think of indicators of academic success. So on the first point, how do researchers distribute their time? I found that researchers are overworked. So of course, this is self-report, but 80% of full-time researchers said that they work more than 40 hours per week. Someone even said 80 hours, and that was a maximum of our survey. So even though it's self-report, it shows that they feel overworked. I also found that they wish they would be able to spend more time on research and less time writing grants and on other tasks, especially meetings and administration. And the second part of my survey was to understand what they thought of different academic success indicators. So I extracted some of the indicators of success and the factors that lead researchers to success that were mentioned in my interviews and my focus groups. And for each of them, I would ask the survey respondents to rate how important this indicator is in advancing their career, in advancing science, and to their personal satisfaction. So I had 18 different indicators. I'm not going into depth, but I just wanted to give you a big idea of the findings. So again, this is a very complex chart, and I'm going to blur it to make sure that you're not tempted to read it. But all I want to say is that there were some indicators that were taught to advance science, but not careers. And these were most often related to openness, transparency, quality, innovation. But there were also indicators that advanced careers, but were not taught to advance science. And these were mostly related to competition, status, and prestige. So there's a disconnect between what advanced science is and what advanced careers. It's not always the same thing. So I'll just sum up all of my results so far so I can come up with the recommendations, which is the portion where I would like us to discuss. So as I've mentioned, the first step of my project was to conduct a literature review. I found that we know a lot about researchers in research integrity topics, but we know very little about other research actors. I found that we know the system is part of the problem, but we don't address the system. We target awareness of researchers. I found then in my interviews and focus group, I found that there's a clear issue in the way we assess researchers, that the extreme funnel structure of research careers strengthens the existing problems, and that nobody feels able or responsible to solve the problems. And finally, from the survey, I found that researchers are overworked and that indicators that advance careers don't always advance science. So that led me to make some recommendations. And before I start, I want to say my findings are not revolutionary, and probably everything I've said so far you thought, well, I knew that because I'm a researcher and I knew that already. And there's a lot of policy documents, statements that say the same thing. So the DORA, for example, the Leiden Manifesto, the metric tide, the Hong Kong principle. I even put here the SOPS for RI project because I think it's all linked on the fact that we have issues with how science works. And this is not new. But I thought that because I gathered the data to show these findings, it would be interesting to make some recommendations. And I'll show you the 4 recommendations I have in my thesis. And I'd like you to think, if you think they're good, if you think they're implementable, realistic, too broad, too detailed. So you can take note, and then we'll discuss from this part on. So the first recommendation I had was for research on research integrity, and for research integrity approaches, I wanted to, I thought it was important that we looked beyond the researcher. So historically, research integrity was really focused on the researcher, his personality, the ego, and etc. But I really think that now it's more and more important to look at the climates around the researcher, to look at the assessments, the expectations, their career structures, and etc. So not only in research on research integrity, but also in research integrity approaches. The second point that I wanted to raise was that we need to rethink research assessments. And I think this is quite clear, but I had 5 distinctions for that. So the first one is that we have to be transparent and reflective when we use metrics. This is part of the DORA. It's part of a lot of documents, also the Hong Kong principles. We have to complement individual recognition with collective recognition. And this leads me back to my football team of strikers. We have to understand teamwork and understand how to promote teamwork. So I'm thinking some initiatives like credit could help with that, but this is something we could discuss. We have to look at the process behind the output, to look at how research is done. We have to set realistic expectations so that we recognize negative finding, small step research as well. And finally, all of these changes, now I'm talking about research institutions, but these changes should also happen at all levels. So research institutions are often funded by funding schemes that depend on their output as well. And as long as these funding schemes from governments, from national funders do not change, it will be very hard for the institution to change. So rankings and funding to the institution also needs to take this into account. The third recommendation I had was that we need to rethink research career, and this is related to the funnel structure. So what I proposed, and this is something that is proposed in quite a few documents already, is that we, at the PhD level, there should be more skills for students to be able to migrate to non-academic research careers. But there should also be a smoother transition so that there's no stigma against non-academic careers, and that maybe the PhD students can be introduced earlier to non-academic careers. But one thing that is not covered so often is that I also think that we should diversify academic careers within academia so that we have different academic options and not just the typical PI with a lab doing his share of research, teaching, and services, having diversity in the options for tenure in academia. And finally, the last recommendation that I have is that we need to unite actors to discuss and coordinate action. This is a difficult one, but it's based on everyone is passing the ball to everyone. And what I say is that we actually need to have recommendation documents and discussions that involve different actors, and also more research on these actors that we don't hear their opinions so often. This is, of course, a bit utopic maybe, but one concrete recommendation that I think is important here is to start involving young researchers, PhDs, postdocs, tenure track researchers into important decisional committees. Quite often they will take senior researchers who have established a reputation, but I think we're missing a point by not including the young researchers. So before I go into the discussion questions, I just want to say a few thanks. First to my participants. I always thank my participants because they really provided a lot of their time and a lot of their brain juice for my project. So I'm really thankful. I want to thank my supervisor, Wim Pinkston, and also Raymond de Vries, who was a mentor throughout this project. So he really helped me too. And then some other contributors that were important in more specific parts of the project. So on that note, let's go to the discussion. So what I thought was that we could look at the 4 recommendations that I have. And I wanted to ask you, because I didn't do anything. These recommendations are still in my thesis, and I'm not sure what to do with them. So I wondered, first, do you think they are useful? Do you think they're implementable? That might be a delicate one. Second, how should recommendations like these be disseminated? Should I publish a high visibility paper with something like that? Should I teach a course? Should I make a statement? What do we do with recommendations like these? And third, mostly for early career researchers, but also for all researchers, what are your tricks for changing how scientific system works? What can we do? So on that note, I will stop sharing and